All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Eldar. I work at Max Planck Institute for Informatics in Germany in a city called Saarbrücken. And today I'm going to talk about human pose estimation. But before that, I just wanted to say thanks to the organizers for this wonderful event and for giving me an honor to take this stage. All right. So I'm going to be talking about the work that we did at MPI around 2015 until 2017 with all these wonderful people. And in particular, Misha Andrelyuk is actually a native of Odessa, who is one of my advisors. Right? So let's get into it. What is the task of human pose estimation? It's a classical computer vision task that's been researched for quite a long time. And the task is to localize the major skeletal joints of humans in the images. All right? And in particular, we're interested in solving it in the most general case. So we want to do completely in the wild, unconstrained scenes where that depict complex scenes. Humans are in a variety of activities, of appearances. Camera angles can be different. Right, so the number of people is unknown, and if we consider the video sequences, the number of people changes as people enter or leave the video sequences. So we want to solve this the most general case. Okay, so to step back a little bit, why do we want to detect the body joints of the people? What's the use of it? As the famous rapper put it in one of his songs, we should actually stop speaking the natural language and start using the body language instead. I don't like rap music, I'm more of a rocker, but in this case, the guy actually, what he says has some scientific grounding. So, a colleague of mine is working on the intersection of computer vision and psychology, and he's researching a phenomenon called wrapper. So wrapper is the type of interactions in the small groups of people where you have a good flow. Essentially, people are in sync with each other, they understand each other, and the opposite of that is low wrapper. It's like an awkward situation where I think every one of us found themselves once or a few times in the life where it's a bit awkward in a group of people you're talking to. So they recorded a data set where they scripted people to sit in the small groups and talk, and they were trying to detect the wrapper based on non-verbal signals, such as facial features. What's interesting for us is the hand motion, and he was able to detect the low wrapper with a confidence that is higher than above chance, just using these non-verbal features. Right. Another cool application of, and by the way, there is a huge scope of applications for pose estimation that goes outside of the scope of this topic, but I'm just gonna touch upon a few of them. So there is a really cool startup or a company in the Bay Area called Cherry Labs, and they're building this AI-powered safe houses. So essentially, they install the cameras around the house, and then they sell the processing unit that essentially runs human pose estimation. Right? And with that kind of representation, it lends itself very naturally to detect unusual behaviors. For example, or dangerous behaviors. For example, when the person is about to fall, or when the person falls down on the ground. Right, or if you, for instance, if the burglar comes in your house, you want to detect them. They also have a product for senior people. For senior people, it's actually a very big problem that they tend to fall more often than younger people. And this kind of automated system that's connected to the medical care services is super helpful. Another important application for pose estimation is augmented reality, where you essentially want to create a digital avatar of yourself that replicates your body motions. And in order to do that, it's actually really crucial to accurately track the body motions. And it's very subtle. You have to do it very precise, otherwise it falls in this kind of uncanny valley. Right, you want to do it really well. And beyond that, there is all sorts of applications, such as motion capture, which is used in the film industry, medical applications. Body posture gives a good indication for your health. Right. So, just to give an overview on the related work. In the 2000s, people were already working on the problem of pose estimation, and one of the models that was particularly popular was the pictorial structure model that gave kind of reasonable results. In the second stage, with the introduction of convolutional neural networks in the mainstream computer vision, people applied convnets to this problem, and they achieved good results. But mostly, people are focusing on this very simplified setting where you have a pre-cropped human in the photo, and you just need to detect the body joints of that human. Right, there was very little publications on how to do pose estimation in the unconstrained scenes, and we in our work we try to argue that you care about the presence of other humans because people occlude each other and interact, and you want to run the pose estimation jointly in the images. Right, so the naive approach of how you would solve it, which is also called top-down approach in the literature. It's a two-stage approach. In the first stage, you run your favorite object detector that gives you bounding boxes, right? And in the second stage, you run your off-the-shelf pose estimation algorithm per bounding box. All right, and it works reasonably well, except that you have to have a very good person detector. If, for instance, if your data is limited, it actually becomes very tricky to get good performance out of your object detector. And if the object detector misses a person, then you're out of luck. All right, you cannot recover from this mistake, from this error in the second stage. So, what we propose in our work is a joint formulation for person detection and pose estimation, which we refer to as joint detection and pose estimation, but also another name for that in the literature is bottom-up paradigm. All right, so. What we do, we formulate it as spatial grouping, and in the first stage, we compute the human body part detections for all people in the image, and we jointly estimate their body poses. So that's as opposed to this top-down approach where you start with the person detectors. All right, so this is the outline of our method, which we published at CVPR, which was spread between two papers. Two papers is better than one, even though it's kind of one big method. So we start with the input image. In the first part, we compute body part detections for every person in the image indiscriminately. In the second stage, I'm going to talk about building a spatial graph that uses the nodes, that uses these detectors as its nodes. And in the third stage, I'm going to talk about the inference that can transform this graph into connected components corresponding to individual person instances. Okay, so now let's start with the first stage. So I'm just going to start with the first paper that addressed human pose estimation using convolutional neural networks. It was a very naive solution. They just feed-forwarded input image through a deep convnet and formulated the learning as regression. So they asked the network to directly regress the list of XY coordinates in the image. And that turned out to be a very difficult task to ask the network to do. It's just this formulation doesn't lend itself very nicely for training neural networks. So the accuracy of such approach was low. So instead, and they had to iterate this architecture in several stages. So they would then take the initial prediction and then feed forward it through it another refinement network, and then the third stage, and that kind of gave them reasonable accuracy. But that still wasn't good enough, so the really first paper that gave really nice results in the pose estimation was done by Thompson in the NYU, and essentially they framed human pose estimation as a regression of heat maps. So instead of running it through the fully connected network, they designed a fully convolutional network that regresses the heat maps, and essentially they formulated it as a detection problem. They also additionally jointly trained it with a graphical model, but that turned out to be not critical, as later papers showed. So we, as a foundation for our own body part detectors, we wanted to use something similar. So we looked at the advances in the semantic segmentation literature, and in particular the fully convolutional convnets that are trained for pixel labeling, where you ask the network to label each pixel as to belonging to a certain semantic class. So we repurposed one of the semantic segmentation networks called DeepLab from, I think it was from Google. But instead of training it for semantic segmentation, we repurposed it for learning the key point detectors. So essentially, your convnet produces a score map, which is of a coarser resolution than the input. In our case, it was 8 times coarser. And what we wanted to predict, we essentially we construct the ground truth for training this fully convolutional architecture, where we label locations on the heat map as positives if they fall within a certain distance threshold to the ground truth key point location. Right? However, as you can see, that sort of gives you a very coarse predictions for the key points. So again, we'll look at what people do in the object detection community, and in particular in the RCNN paper. They did something similar. They were detecting bounding boxes, but they also had this bounding box regression, which refined the bounding boxes. So we did something similar. We also trained. We added an additional task to the network to predict essentially the geometric offsets from each key point to the center. And that gave us pretty good improvement. Actually, even when you don't use these predictions at test time, just providing an additional supervision to the network improved on the detection task, which is kind of now a known thing in the Jan LeCun, for instance, likes to take about his cake and how you can provide more supervision. So it kind of falls in the same fashion. So first of all, we tested our network on the task on the single pose estimation, just to make sure that we are sort of our backbone convnet is on par with the state of the art at the time, and we sort of had significantly better results, and also we were comparable to the concurrent work at the time. Okay, so but when you deal with the multi-person inference, so what kind of predictions does that network gives you? it gives you these heat maps for your body joints, for each type of them, but at this point it's unconditional, or in the terminology that Bogdan used, it's your unary predictions. Now you need to group them into individual person instances. So first of all, what we do, we need to, in order to perform the grouping, we need to discretize these heat maps to obtain a finite set of body part detections, which we do using non-maximum suppression. So this is a set of body part detections for all the body parts of the people, and that's the output of this first stage. So in the second stage, we're going to use these body part detections, and we're going to build this so-called spatial graph on them. Right? So we're going to augment this set of detections with the edges in a fully connected fashion. So and the idea is to assign certain weights to those edges that indicate whether two detections are likely to belong to the same instance the same person or not. Right? So again, in order to compute those pairwise scores or pairwise probabilities, we turn to we use the convnets for that. So in addition to our already to the detection training objective in our convnet, we ask the convnet to predict the relative locations of body parts with respect to your current body part. So at this location, at this right knee location, we ask the network not only to detect this knee, but we also want it to predict where all the other body parts of the same instance would be. And because convnets have a large receptive field, it's quite natural that even at this location, the network could give a very reasonably good estimate where the neighboring parts are, and not necessarily the neighboring. It can even give a good guess, at least in the ballpark, of where the other body parts are. Right? So here you see the example predictions at the shoulder location, where the top of the head would be, the other shoulder, and also the right knee. And this kind of long-term relationships, it cannot capture well in the complex cases such as this, but at least it gives you the right direction, which could be useful at the inference stage. Okay. The next important detail is how to construct the graph, what kind of connectivity to use. So a naive way would be to build a fully connected graph where we connect all nodes to each other. The problem with that is that with the complete graph, the first one is as we've seen already, these long-range connections, they're not always reliable. And even if you include them, they're not going to give you much information, but they will actually result in a very large graph, which will make the inference slower. Right. So instead, we make the assumption that it's enough to only connect the nodes that are in a reasonably close neighborhood in the graph, in the body graph to each other. All right, so I'm actually running quite quickly, so we'll have more time for the next speakers. Now we are moving to the final part of our algorithm, is the inference part. But before that, I just want to touch on the piece in the prior work that's actually very, very relevant. So, as I already mentioned, in the 2000s, a very popular, very dominant model in the literature for solving this type of problems were pictorial structures. And it was formulated as the following minimization problem, and I can describe it really briefly. So it would have two terms, which you've already seen in Bogdan's talk. It's the unary term and the pairwise term. So the unary term is just essentially the score of the detector for a particular key point type. And the pairwise score is typically encodes the prior on the spatial relationships between the pair of parts. And the reason for this model was that in the 2000s, we didn't have convnets. The detectors of the time, they were reasonably weak. So there would be a lot of false detections. And you had to filter them out somehow, and that's where you would find very useful these pairwise constraints that would kind of constrain the pairs of detections to fire together. Okay, so coming back to our setting, what we want to do, we're given this graph with body part detections, and our task is to compute the subgraph of this graph such that each connected component corresponds to an individual human. So we would have to first agree on how we would define the graph decompositions. And apparently that's quite important. So a very naive way would be, if you want to kind of define the partition or decomposition of the graph, you could just assign the labels to the nodes. So all the green nodes corresponding to one cluster, we would give them label 1. To this one, we give the label 2, and to the red subgraph, we give the label 3. The problem with that, there is infinitely many labelings that would encode the same decomposition. So instead, a nicer, in terms of optimization at least, is to encode decompositions as with edge labeling. So instead, all the edges that are kept in the original graph, we assign a label 1 to them, and the edges that are cut, so the edges that go from one component to the other, they're assigned the label 0. And that significantly reduces the search space, right? So I guess that's the slide with the most math in this talk. But it's actually it's not that easy, or it's not that difficult to go through it. And by the way, so we're solving this graph decomposition. We're formulating the graph decomposition problem as a minimum cost multi-cut. And by the way, I'm not an expert on that. I'm sort of on the application side, but I will kind of quickly go through it. So what it is an integer linear program. In particular, it's a binary program where we have two types of variables. The first type of variable is x, which is defined for each detection d, i.e. each node in the graph, right? And it can be on and off. So if it's on, the detection is retained in the final solution of the problem, and it's 0 if we want to suppress this detection. For instance, if there is a false positive body part detection that's not supported by all the other evidence, the model allows it to switch off. So these variables, they have associated costs, which are essentially, we read them out directly as the outputs of the convnet, right? And the second one is this pairwise cost that I was describing in the first part. So the variable y is defined essentially for every edge, and it is 1 if the edge connects the two nodes that belong to the same instance, and it's 0 if it doesn't. So that's the objective function, and it is subject to a few constraints that define the feasible space. In particular, we have to make sure that assignments of x's and y's are consistent, and also there is a transitivity constraint. Essentially, if these are our two, on the left and the right, if these are the two hypotheses of connected components, but they are connected by one of the edge and not the others, this is inconsistent, because this edge says that these two components belong together, but this cut edge doesn't support this hypothesis, right? So. And that's essentially checked with a cycle constraint, which essentially says that for any cycle in the graph, the edge cannot be the edge can be cut, I think, only once. So how do we solve this problem? Initially, we use the Gurobi solver, which again, we have a lot of overlap here with Bogdan, and he already said that solving this problem with a general purpose interlinear program solver is super slow. So we actually rely on the heuristic based on the Kernighan-Lee algorithm from the 70s, which is kind of a greedy approach that starts with some initial feasible hypothesis, and it starts greedily moving nodes one by one between different connected components in the graph. And it does it purely based on the greedy objective of the cost function, right? So essentially we have two connected components, A and B, and we have a node, and we consider the edges that connect this node with all the other nodes within its own connected component, A, and all the edges that connect it with the component B. And the rest we ignore. And we essentially compute the difference in the objective function resulting from moving node A to the connected component in B. All right, and if that reduces our overall objective function, we do the move. And I think we, much like in the reinforcement learning, we actually compute a whole sequence of such exchanges, and we compute the total energy difference, and if that's negative, so if the cost goes down, we proceed with this iteration, right? So actually, the same formulation it's quite general, and it's applied for all types for many different types of problems in the computer vision. So the another work done at our lab considers several applications for this type of formulation. So they apply this graph-based formulation to instance segmentation, where you first run semantic segmentation neural network that gives you the semantic labelings for each pixel in the class, but it doesn't give you any instances. So they augment it with some pairwise terms that kind of give you the affinities of which pixels belong together in one instance and which don't. And as a result, you get instance predictions using the same framework that I've already described. It can also be applied to the object tracking. Again, you can kind of view that you can start with the bounding box detections in each frame of your video sequence, right? And you want to associate bounding boxes across time. So you want to bounding boxes corresponding to the same person end up in the same cluster after the clustering is done. So there's already like 3 different applications for this type of general formulation. So coming back to our pose estimation stuff, we evaluated our approach on the MPI human pose data set, and you can see as a baseline we used the faster CNN object detector with a unary based pure single person pose estimation approach, and we significantly improved the accuracy with our own formulation. This is due, I think, that faster CNN was was underperforming on the object detection side. The problem is, at the time, the inference time was super slow. It was like 500 seconds per image, and that's sort of that's totally inappropriate, but that's because we use the Gurobi solver for solving this integer linear program. So in our follow-up paper, we significantly improved runtime and also accuracy by using the heuristic solver based on this Kernighan-Lin algorithm. Right? In fact, it was quite suitable for real-time applications, so we even demoed it at EECVC 2016, because what's the very nice property of this bottom-up approach is you only need to run a convnet once over your entire image and then perform grouping, as opposed to having this top-down formulation where you have to make this very expensive evaluation of your object detector bounding box classifier of the proposals. So these were kind of results we got at the time. Remember, it was 2016, but it worked reasonably well, I have to say. There are still some problems that it would have. It would confuse left and right, symmetrical body parts. In case of severe occlusions, where the instances would kind of be mixed up, and when people kind of perform a complex interaction, also things would break. I mean, there is no way out of it. Yes, code available. Give me a star. I'll be applying for jobs soon. They are looking at GitHub. That's kind of how it is. I haven't finished, by the way. There is how much time left? There is still time.
You can go.
Sure. So what I really like about this graph-based joint formulation, it's a very general purpose model, and we really trivially extended our pose estimation from images to do a pose tracking in videos. So these are the predictions of our method, and here we perform detection, pose estimation, and we also track people in time. We track individual instances of people. And we do it jointly. So how did just to look on the related work, sort of in the literature, people would either do multi-target tracking, where they would track instances, but those would be bounding boxes. People also did human pose tracking, but there would be only a single person. So we kind of did the combination of these tasks. All right, so how did we do it? It's a trivial extension of what I already presented. So we already know how to extract these body part detections in the images. We just do the same for the video sequences for the other frames. In the similar way, we build the spatial graphs within each frame, and we use the same pairwise costs as we've defined before. What we do, the only thing we do in addition, we define the temporal edges that connect the subgraphs within the frame with each other. So we build a large spatio-temporal graph. And the only difference really, and what we want to do, we want to compute the subgraph of this big spatio-temporal graph, which would give us the tracks of people in time with their poses, right? And the only difference is we just compute this temporal frame, we compute costs for these temporal edges, which we do using deep matching and sieve descriptors and so on. But then we run the same inference algorithm as before, and that gives us essentially the multi-person tracking. And what's the advantage of actually running it jointly? than doing some kind of two-stage approach where you first track an instance and then do pose estimation per track, is that in some frames you can have a very noisy detections, right? And by doing this joint inference over this big spatial temporal graph, you can actually improve detection in the frames where it is weak using the evidence from the neighboring frames, right? And we actually showed that the accuracy of this big spatial temporal grouping improves over the naive two-stage approach. And in particular, the improvement came from quite difficult body parts, such as ankles, wrists, like this, the extremal body parts. They're typically the most difficult to detect. They get occluded, they move fast, and so on. So that kind of supported our hypothesis that doing this joint inference is beneficial, right? So kind of to support the research in this multi-person tracking, we collected a big data set with multiple people, video sequences, and we annotated key points for each person. So each video is about 100 frames, and we annotate densely frames in the middle, but then also we provide sparse annotations. We even had a workshop at ICCV and EECVC last year where we ran the challenge. And the data set is available for research, so download it and have a look. What's interesting for me in particular, if this video will be played, I don't know. Okay, the video doesn't play for some reason, but there are some really challenging sequences in this data set where people are entangled really closely with each other, like in this there would be like a wrestling sequence here, and that's where all state-of-the-art approaches for pose estimation, they break because people are kind of hugging each other, and it's all these approaches fail, and it really requires a very high-level reasoning to actually, which we humans possess. And it's just interesting to think because most of the research on this, on the intelligence now goes in the fields where, such as reinforcement learning and navigation and so on. But even in the classical computer vision problems, there is still enough scope for solving these really challenging instances. Yeah, sorry that the video didn't play. So now I'm kind of going to wrap up, but I want to give an outlook because this work has been done around 2015 to 2016, so it's pretty dated, but now it's interesting to see where sort of community went. So the bottom-up methods that do kind of this detection by grouping, then now you can say that they are mainstream. So the top-down methods in the end achieved better accuracy, but if you want to achieve real-time detections, for instance, OpenPose is also a bottom-up method. They use slightly different detectors, they use slightly different pairwise terms and inference, but in principle it's a very similar approach. All right. The recent paper by Google called Person Lab that does joint instance segmentation and pose estimation, it's actually very, very similar to ours. They also use, anyone from Google here? No? Oh, good. They ripped us off completely, but it's fine. They got very good results, so we don't mind, and they cite us. Another cool application of our, and by the way, also Newell from University of Michigan, he did end-to-end. So in our approach is kind of two-stage. We have this ConvNet-based detection, and then we have discrete optimization-based grouping. He proposed associative embedding, where he kind of pushed this grouping inference into the ConvNet. Also very interesting work. What pose estimation could also be useful for instance, you may argue, you only do 2D pose estimation. Now people do all sorts of 3D reconstruction, 3D pose estimation, 3D body model fitting. In one of the papers that predicted, one of the first papers that predicted full 3D body model from the natural images that came from Max Planck in Tübingen, they actually used our body part detectors from the deep cut paper so they solve this 3D reconstruction in the 2D in the two-stage manner. So first they detected 2D key points on the human body, and in the second stage they fitted the 3D model so as to it matches the 2D key point detections. Right, so that kind of also goes into this direction of end-to-end learning versus modular approaches that Matthias was speaking about. They actually figured out that the direct regression of like body model from the image is actually pretty difficult to do. Right, another really cool application for pose estimation that kind of came from an unexpected direction. There was a team of like a cross-discipline team of mostly neuroscientists from universities of Harvard and Tübingen. They were building a toolbox for analyzing the behavior of animals in the lab setting, and they used my pose estimation code to build their toolbox. So essentially they augmented it with a graphical user interface to do the annotations of animals in the field, and it really exploded. So they published their work in Nature Neuroscience, where they kind of studied the performance of this pose estimation on animals, how it works, and thanks to ImageNet pre-training, they found that because we use, as backbones, we use ResNet, or yes, they already use the ResNet version. They found it sufficient to annotate 1 to 200 training samples to actually do reliable tracking of animals. And now the author of this framework said that it's being used by more than 200 labs, mostly like in biology and neuroscience. And they do all sorts of crazy things, like tracking this, I think it's called the Drosophila fly, how it lays eggs, or they do experiments on mice a lot and whatnot, like some crazy fishes. There's apparently this toolbox is known much wider than my own pose estimation stuff, even though they use the same algorithm. But that's pretty cool. So it's actually a very streamlined version, framework. You can just download their Python package, quickly annotate with a simple GUI. You can quickly annotate your video sequence, in one click train the key point detector, and then kind of do this sort of thing. So people in the biological and behavioral neuroscience community, they like this toolbox a lot. Another thing that I just wanted to speculate about, like this adversarial robustness, is apparently a very big, not apparently, it is a very huge topic in the machine learning now. And in particular, the researchers at the university in Belgium, they designed a real image, which they printed, that would fool the YOLO object detector, right? So you see that it's sufficient to only cover a very small portion of your body to completely fool this person detector. Now you see that it will fail it on this person, right? And that's where I would speculate that these bottom-up approaches, they could actually help to improve the. Yes, you don't want to run this on the real car yet. These bottom-up approaches, they could add additional robustness to your detection, because you actually do perform detection on a body part level, and even if part of your body parts would be failed to detect, you can actually still recover by detecting the other body joints, and then they will be put in the full instance. Right. So with this, I would like to conclude. I've presented an approach for a multi-person pose estimation in the scenes in the wild. It's based on the state of the art in the conventional computer vision on ConvNets, and it uses spatiotemporal grouping for solving this subgraph multicut problem. Yes. Thank you very much.
Questions?
As I know, the state-of-the-art approach for 2D pose estimation is heat maps. So the ConvNet outputs like each heat map for each key point type. Why you used detector and not heat map?
So it is also heat maps. The difference is in the supervision. So in most of the approaches, which actually start with that work from NYU, they were regressing heat maps, and those heat maps were constructed as like as a Gaussian, as a smooth Gaussian around the key point. And you train and you use L2 laws to directly regress those Gaussians. For some reason, I've spent quite some time actually implementing it. Didn't work for me for some reason. So instead, I went for this hard. So this is kind of a soft heat map. So what I used cross entropy loss, and I trained just a hard. I trained it on these hard heat maps, which are either 0 or 1. So the thing is, in my experiments, it actually it was able to converge faster. I could use smaller batches with this type of training, and I think I've seen in some papers that cross entropy loss behaves a little bit nicer in learning than mean squared error. But you're right, people use the soft heat maps a lot. So they work pretty much the same.
Maybe the problem with cross-entropy loss, personally I trained hand pose estimator and I use intersection over union loss. This continues and it works with heat maps like perfect.
Okay, so that's, you mean for detecting of bounding boxes?
No, heat maps.
For heat maps.
Just point with blurred location.
I mean, I never had the experience with the intersection of the union loss myself.
Maybe it was like popular in last years. As I know, your work is 2016.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I haven't. I have to say, I haven't worked on pose estimation in the last year and a half. So maybe I might have missed something.
Next question.
Someone closer here. Yes, the person.
Thank you for your talk. My question is regarding the last year's SOTA dense pose. It was like Facebook research paper about also pose estimation, and I'm curious how your approach is based on segmentation on deep lab there. Dense pose based on faster unmasker CNN. So there you have semantic segmentation. Here you have instant segmentation in one pass. So how your work relate to this one, in terms of performance, FPS and everything else?
It's difficult to compare, so the methods are wildly different. Dense pose, it actually solves a more general problem. So in our case, we just detect the sparse body joints, whereas dense pose actually gives you a dense partial reconstruction. So in that sense, it gives you a much richer information. But it's a top-down method, so in principle, if it's based on faster CNN, then you have to perform this expensive evaluation per bounding box. And I have to say, we haven't optimized our method for speed. We kind of demoed it once, but it was implemented in Python and so on. So we kind of, since then, I mean, if you go to CVPR, now there is 20 different demos of pose estimation by all sorts of companies that kind of use different tricks, but I think most of them use this bottom-up paradigm where they would kind of first indiscriminately detect key points and then do the bottom-up inference. But kind of if you want to get the most accuracy, I guess these days the best results come from this kind of RCNN-based top-down approaches. I think there was someone in the back.
2 more questions.
Yeah, that person in the blue shirt was first.
Thank you very much for interesting speech. And oh, sorry. And my question is a bit some kind of disbelief. You said that when we have an occlusion, the scenes becomes more worse. And I agree that it's very difficult when, for example, we have mess of the legs, arms, and so on. But when we don't have an occlusion, for example, we don't need such a complicated technique to split the graph. We can create a minimum spanning tree and then split it in the very fast way without any problems, and it works very fast. So do you really claim that when occlusion occurs, your technique works better than any, for example, other technique, simple techniques with graph algorithms?
So I didn't do comparison with other grouping methods. That in this particular approach allows you to switch off the nodes, this formulation, and that's useful exactly in the cases of occluded joints. So as I already said, going forward, this particular way of solving the problem by formulating this graph, it's nice conceptually. Maybe you can choose a different heuristics, but my own kind of message out of this whole work is this bottom-up approach of doing detection by grouping. And I'm not really hung on the particular pairwise costs or the inference techniques. Those vary, and in different works I've seen different kinds of heuristics, but the main message is to perform this bottom-up inference.
Okay, last question.
From the conceptual point of view, your approach, I mean, combining the multi-cut ILP with the body part detection with the network is similar to what Bogdan was claiming, at least in his talk at some place. And the natural question is whether you see a way how to learn such a combination of models end to end.
So that's a very good question. In fact, a colleague of mine who was also on the credit slides at the beginning, Siu Tang, she is now a postdoc at Max Planck in Tübingen. She had I think it was in Europe, submission on end-to-end learning of multicuts, and I didn't look very close at it, but I think they formulated it as inference on MRFs. So my problem, to be honest, I don't really see the point of doing this end-to-end. Why? Because the model that I have is really limited by the quality of the pairwise terms, for which we know already the ground truth, right? And if the ConvNet predicted perfect pairwise terms and perfect unary terms, in that case you don't really need the inference, right? So in my case, most the effort should go on kind of of creating better terms for this optimization model, and then this multi-cut inference, it can actually fix some of the problems that the ConvNet introduces. But if we, like I said, if we have perfect terms, it's just we don't need another training objective, I think, to train them.
Let's thank Eldar again. And you need to choose the best question.
I don't know. I think I like the question of Boris a lot, but he gets the book anyway. So I think the lady in the second row, I think her question was the most interesting. Yes, thank you very much again.